Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming and welcome. So we will start now. We have about 23 people on Zoom. So welcome to everyone at home tuning in with Zoom for us tonight. Thank you for doing that and welcome. And there are quite a few non-members I know who are attending tonight via Zoom. So welcome to you. And if you are interested in the Society next time, please do check out our website. And the public lecture in November is about blue carbon. It's about the oceans. So that's on about the 5th of November. So check that one out. While we are recording this, could you please make sure at home that you've turned your microphones off and your cameras off as well. There will be an opportunity for questions, both from the floor here and also via the chat function for those of you who are listening via Zoom. So at any time during this evening, during the lecture, you can type a question on chat and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. Okay. Now, if I may, just a few reminders to our members, either present here or at home. First of all, you know that, excuse me, our AGM, annual general meeting, is on the 19th of October. Please make sure you have registered if you wish to participate, but also that you have voted. We want everyone, if possible, to vote on in advance. Online, and I think today Lilia sent out a reminder with the link there at the top of the email. So if you haven't voted, please do so. That's a very important formal matter for the Society once a year, as you know. Also, can I encourage you all, if you haven't put in to the photo competition, please do so. Images, you can put in up to 3 for $5. And it can be the smallest outback settlement, or it can be from Brisbane City. Any image that you like, please send it through. And again, that's on the home page. There's a link there to put your entries in. So please do get your photos in. Some good prizes. And lastly, last announcement tonight. We've been watching, Ralph and I have been watching avidly every morning the press conference to see if there was going to be a lockdown. As of this morning, there isn't. So it's all go for the Upper Brisbane Valley trip, which is, well, a lot of people, including us, are going up tomorrow afternoon. And the actual trek is Thursday, Friday this week. So it's all go. I know that many of you listening at home are on that trip. So yes, and some people here too tonight are going on that. Should be very good. So thankfully, lockdowns have receded at the moment. Now, okay, very important then. Let's move on to tonight. And before I introduce our speaker, okay, I think that's all right. Right, so our speaker tonight is Lee Johnson. Now, if you've read the blurb about Lee, we're very privileged tonight to have Lee come along and talk to us. Lee is a former Fire Commissioner for Queensland, 2002 to 2015, so 13 years. Lee was our Fire Commissioner. He played a key role in the development of the urban search and rescue capability within the fire service, which is a very important arm of the fire service that help with even with earthquakes around our region, Christchurch, for example. So that's another very important development that Lee participated in, or in fact led. And currently, Lee is on a couple of important boards regarding fires and so on. the Board Director of the Bushfire Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre, and also a founding member of emergency. I want to get this right. I'm looking at my notes. Emergency Leaders for Climate Action, which is a very important one going forward now, and involves, I think, a number of former fire commissioners from different states. So, again, as I said, very privileged to have Lee come and talk to us this evening. The presentation Lee will present focuses on climate science factors relating to bushfire, and perhaps some of the current preparedness levels in Queensland, and perhaps what we may have to do in the near future. So, without further ado, I will hand over to Lee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arathne and Lilia. Well, we had a few attempts, ladies and gentlemen, to have this session throughout the year, but obviously because of the COVID situation, it had to be postponed. So it's a really great honour to be here tonight. Also to catch up with a former colleague and Ralph Carlisle, who used to work in the department, in the chem unit, and it's a long time ago, Ralph, but you're still Ralph and I'm still Lee. We had some good times. I'm not a climate scientist. I'm a firefighter, 40 years, 1975, come up through the ranks to the top job. And in retirement, I've, for my sins, been collaborating with my colleague from New South Wales, Greg Mullins, to form Emergency Leaders for Climate Action, which is a group of fire and emergency service chiefs connected to the Climate Council and supported by the Climate Council to advocate, and particularly we advocated very strongly to try and warn the federal government about the 2019 fire season that was coming. Unfortunately, we didn't make much of a dent there, but the season played out just as we thought. So tonight, what I'm going to do is talk about bushfire as a hazard in Queensland and tell you a bit about the journey through my career and through my eyes, what climate has done. As I said, I'm not a climate scientist, so I won't spend too much time on the actual science. I think people are well across that. And we'll talk about, obviously look at some of the climate science, look at the impact of climate change and what it means, and of course, what the future brings. An American guy called Stephen Pine, Professor Stephen Pine, says that we've now moved out of the Anthropocene to the Pyrocene. That is, from the age of man to the age of fire. And I think he's pretty well fundamentally right. So we'll talk all about that. And I'm hoping that everybody online, welcome to those people online, can hear and see as well. So, okay, I think everybody involved tonight will have a reasonable understanding, if not of the exact scientific detail, but what's been happening in the world. And as we know, climate drives weather. And what we're seeing here is increasing and a warming trend.
You can see that screen.
Somebody talking. What we're seeing obviously is an increasing heat trend. Just check if everybody's got that up the presentation online. Yep. And I think we're certainly feeling that. And when I start to talk about some of my history, going back to 2002 to some of the experiences that we've had in Queensland with different types of hazards, it'll illustrate that the point of what's happening in change in what we're experiencing. Now, Queensland, as Queenslanders, we know that cyclones, flood, storm are sort of the number one, top of the hit parade, natural hazards for us. But bushfire is now becoming more prominent. We've had a bushfire problem, but nothing like southeastern and South Australia and southwestern Australia. So what everybody's worried about, obviously, is increasing long-term warming trends. But if you see the blue line, one of the most important things about warming is the oceans warming, because the ocean is basically the engine room of weather all over the world. And as we see Arctic, more so than Antarctic at the moment, ice breaking up, temperature changes in the waters around there, that will definitely impact weather systems, particularly in the Atlantic and North America. But oceans are the engine drivers for weather. A colleague of mine, Rafni, said I was on the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC. That research body has now ended its time, and we are now called Natural Hazards Research Australia. So I'm a director on that board, and that's basically federal government funded, along with all the jurisdictions in Australia putting money into the study of natural hazards. And a colleague of mine on that, Dr. Greg Ayres, formerly of the Bureau, he was telling me one day that the number of sensors that the Bureau have in the ocean is just staggering. And across the world, all of the major countries, they are monitoring trends in ocean temperature and currents to within, links up to data and scientific reporting. Excuse me, it's happening all the time. So they're monitoring this stuff extremely closely. So that for me is a big concern, and that is the trend. And you can see the trend at the moment has sort of dropped down a little bit for the ocean, but long term, that's a major problem for us. What we've been told and we've come to expect is that as we do move and shift into a new climate, we're looking at more extreme weather, hotter weather, and the effects of that. And one of the effects of that is of course, heat wave, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So, I mean, people will argue, and I don't like to argue with people about their views on climate change per se. People say, well, we're going to get another ice age, or something's going to happen, or we may. But what's going to happen? We're going to go through a period of extreme heating, and I don't think anybody alive for the next couple of 100 years is going to see the next ice age. It may come, but that's not a reason to not believe that something is happening to our climate right now, and particularly on the hot side. So in the last 50 years, heat waves have doubled, and a well-proven fact is heat waves kill more people than anything else, basically, all over the world. It's just a phenomena that is very troubling, particularly in large urbanised cities with elderly people not getting ventilation, more worried about crime and security, having their homes and their units closed up, and heat waves are a real problem. I think there's 42 degrees coming later this week for us, but that's not a heat wave just yet. This is the other fact that's occurring. Bushfire seasons are definitely starting earlier and going longer. Traditionally in Australia, you would see the onset of spring in northern Australia, the fire season would start, and as we move through spring into summer and late summer, it would move its way fairly evenly, fairly predictably through Australia until late summer in Victoria, Tasmania, and parts of Western Australia and South Australia. That's not so at the moment, not as predictable, if you like, as it used to be. And a factor from that is the window
now I can hear it.
of opportunity for
Okay, I think I'm okay now.
hazard reduction burning is decreasing. This slide, observed trends in FFDI, which is the Forest Fire Danger Index. it's red. You probably don't need to know anything more than that at the moment. There's a grass fire danger index and a forest fire danger index, which go in to make up the fire danger rating, which I'll show you in a moment. So this trend of warming, of drying is real and it's happening. This slide is talking about rainfall, particularly winter rainfall in southeastern southern Australia. As you know, basically we have summer rainfall, we can have cyclones in North Queensland and firestorms in Victoria in December and January. So we normally get most of our rain, but if southern Australia doesn't get its rainfall period, which is basically through winter and spring, very concerning, very concerning. So that's been happening. And the 2018 and 19 fires particularly were at the end of a very long drought, and the antecedent conditions were drought. That's what set up those fires that we had the last couple of years. So the fire danger rating that you would see in the media, and you look up online or whatever and find out, oh, the fire danger rating for such and such a district is very high, it's high, severe. I'll make a pointer for the people here, but what I'm pointing out is the original scale, the fire danger rating, only ever used to go to there, to 100. That was designed by a fellow called MacArthur in the early 60s out of Canberra, out of the CSIRO. And until about 2009-10, we had to introduce a new category, 100 plus, catastrophic, or in Victoria they call it code red. So that didn't exist a number of years ago. It's changed since, and Queensland has had a couple of catastrophic fire danger ratings since this was created. What does that mean? Well, in a danger rating of 25 to 49, that is, sorry, it's not a very clear slide, you basically cannot physically stand in front of the fire and fight it. So any bushfire that's coming at you with flame heights, metre and a half, you cannot direct what we call direct attack. You've basically got to get out of its way and work on the flanks or on the edges of the fire and try and steer it or do something with it. So you can imagine a fire that starts in a forest under severe, extreme or catastrophic conditions is going to be difficult to control, and in fact at catastrophic and probably extreme, almost impossible to control by firefighting forces. And everybody prays for rain. What happens there as well is the weather conditions that are created when fires occur in this top end of the scale, they create their own weather systems. And that weather system also adds to thunderstorms, thunder clouds, extra lightning, and just makes for a chaotic situation. So the difficulty for us is that with a longer season, with reduced opportunity to reduce hazards and dryness, overall dryness in the soil, increasingly dry, very difficult circumstances for fire agencies, land management agencies like parks, wildlife, those sort of services, as well as the real fire service and fire and rescue, very, very difficult. This slide is basically telling us pretty much the obvious, that fire danger index days of 50 plus are on the way up, and dramatically so if temperature keeps increasing the way it's being predicted to increase. And I think one of the things when I look at fires, for example, in California, is almost a sense of that in the not too distant future, the next step is desertification, because the intensity of fires in large parts of the US is just so extreme. At a point, there won't be any more vegetation to burn. It'll just be eroded hillsides and denuded vegetation. Southeastern Australia, Victoria has a very similar climate, and southern New South Wales, or a lot of New South Wales. So that's not a good indicator for us. It's a scary one. So what does this mean? Some facts that we've just been talking about: the longer fire seasons, more days of very high fire danger and above means that we cannot get the burns that need to be done. Drier fuels, more lightning strikes, and overlapping fire seasons. Now, I talked about it moving down through Australia nicely. It was quite a common occurrence for Queensland to send firefighters during our summer to New South Wales or Victoria to support them. Now that window for interstate backing up of each other is also getting narrower, because the resources of one state may or may not necessarily be available. It's not impossible, but there's pressure, and that applies to the pressure of aerial firefighting resources as well. So there's a body called the National Aerial Firefighting Centre, which I was on originally when it was first formed back in 2003. And that's a body that helps coordinate the purchase or leasing of aircraft for Australia-wide for money from the federal government. So the ability to move resources around Australia is also under pressure. And you might wonder why occasionally you'll see Canadian or American firefighters come to Australia. There's plenty of American and Canadian aircraft come to Australia in our fire season. And we also send people to Canada and lesser to the United States, mostly to Canada. And we also get people from New Zealand. So that still occurs, but nationally and internationally, those sorts of pressures are building. Obviously, reduced rainfall and that leading up to very long periods of drought is the real problem. Can you say exactly that climate change caused this particular fire or that particular fire? Most probably not. But the compounding and building up over time of these conditions is creating a pretty scary situation. And I talked about at the bottom there, extreme fires, fire-generated storms, and tornadoes. And the guy I mentioned earlier, Stephen Pine, he was the first one to also introduce the term megafire. And we've had a number of megafires in Australia, starting way back, not way back, 2003, the Canberra fires. First recorded what became now known as megafires, where that tornado, storm-generated tornadoes from the pyrocumulus effect is very real and extremely dangerous, extremely dangerous.
Can you explain what the fire-generated storm is?
Yeah, it's we will have questions at the end, but quickly, it's the intensity of the air movement, upward draft of hot air, meeting cold air, thunderstorm heads form, and dry lightning. So it's basically convection of hot air meeting cold air, and that's how the thunderstorms basically are created anyway. Hot air off the land mixing and creating a situation where they create their own weather, because you've got air and oxygen rushing in at ground level to feed the fire. The fire's wanting more oxygen, more air, and it's quite a beast. So we can talk about that a bit later. As I said, I'm not a scientist in that regard, but that's broadly what happens. Now, this is another disturbing thing, the impacts on health and well-being. what we're experiencing, and certainly in the last couple of years, is the impact of what we're now seeing as compounding disasters. So disaster followed by disaster. And not only obviously deaths and injuries are caused, but smoke is one of the biggest killers. 450 people killed by the smoke from the 2019 fires, and about 4,000 people injured just from the smoke. It's not good. I want to talk about the mental health impacts, particularly. My personal view is that these sort of compounding disasters, where we've had the 19 fires in, say, let's pick an area around Batemans Bay, southeast coast of New South Wales, massive fires, and I mean massive fires, cause extensive damage, death and injury. Weeks later, torrential rain, then COVID, then something else. Now, my personal view is that regional Australia is the place where this is being felt the most. There's a lot of regional communities in Australia that are still suffering badly. Limited rebuilding, limited aid, even though there's always millions of dollars supposedly for different types of aid. It's a struggle, and that in fact, the mental health well-being, because most of these firefighters are volunteers. There's a lot of paid staff as well, but there's something like 300,000 volunteers in Australia for rural firefighting, supported by probably 20,000 paid staff. Now, just as our communities wouldn't function without volunteer firefighters, volunteer, in some cases, ambulance officers, we wouldn't get by without the church group or the CWA or the Red Cross in these communities, in regional Australia particularly. And that's where I'm really concerned that the impacts of the fabric of regional Australia, the societies, is under attack from this continual barrage of large-scale, landscape-wide disasters. And it's a terrible thing. There's no doubt about that. It's just absolutely terrible. Yes, the cities suffer too, but in my view, regional Australia is under a lot of pressure. Because the other problem is politicians will flock to these scenes and we're going to rebuild. And the worst thing we can do, and I understand the emotions attached to people and their land, but if we keep building stock back where it's just burnt down, guess what's going to happen in 30, 40, 50 years' time? We're going to burn it down again. There's a lot of housing stock or building stock in Australia that just is built in the wrong place. I hope there are no town planners in the audience, because they're not my least favourite people. Maybe driven by developers and people wanting to make a profit, but from a disaster management point of view, there is a lot of infrastructure in Australia that is in inappropriate locations. And we understand why, historically and over time. That's the circumstance. But we need to build back infrastructure. And just an aside, a lot of the federal government disaster money used to be for replacing what was lost. And lately they've changed the idea of the term build back better. So an example of that, in the 10-11 floods here in Queensland, over 80% of the state flooded. Roads and bridges were swept away, and in Emerald, for example, the same housing estates were flooded 3 times. So if you build a bridge back that's been flooded exactly the same with a road infrastructure, guess what's going to happen? You're just repeating the problem. The bigger issue associated with that is ideally, there should be more investment at the preventative front end than the response end, because it's millions of dollars for aircraft. I told Lilia and Raffney I might get sidetracked sometimes. Just another aside, New South Wales Rural Fire Service spent $100 million in 2019-20 fires on fire retardant. Not a plane, just the chemical. $100 million. That's scary stuff. And anything to do, anybody knows anything about aircraft knows that it's an expensive business. And that's why most of these aircraft here in Australia are leased. They're not owned by government. Anyway, that's an aside. So this is very real. The impact on people and community is something that we should all be very, very concerned about. In Queensland, we're certainly not used to the fires that we saw in 2018 and 19. They behaved more like fires that we see in Southern Australia. The fire danger rating was much higher, going to extreme, and the fire behaviour that we witnessed was very similar. In fact, in the 2018 fires at Yungala behind Mackay, the New South Wales Rural Fire Service 737 actually dropped retardant on the rainforest because it was alight in 2018. In 19, we saw what happened at Vindevara in the rainforest around Vindevara. So this is not in our normal experience. We lost more property than ever in Queensland in 19 and caused a lot of damage. We've had bad fire seasons, 94, 2003, 2013, 12, 2009. We've had bad fire seasons. And QPWS itself has been on a very big journey since 2002 in developing its capability, because the ability to organise to fight or deal with very large, wide, broad area landscape fires wasn't something that we were very good at. 2002, in October of 2002, I was sort of only recently appointed as the commissioner, and we had a very bad fire at Malindi in that area, and we've since had bad fires there again in 18 or 19. And I went out to visit. There was a civilian killed, rural firefighter very badly burnt, about 6 homes lost. And 6 homes for us in Queensland at that time was a lot of damage. And if you know the Stanthorpe Ballandine area, it's very similar to that top end of northern New South Wales, and it's prone to fire country. But when I went there as the commissioner, I came away with a sense of dread, because we had a very poor coordination between the Rural Fire Service and the Urban Fire Service with the police. There just wasn't sufficient, in my view, coordination. And I could see that we're going to be in trouble. We're going to be in very serious trouble. So we started a large number of programs to build that, and that continues today as a very effective capacity within Queensland to deal with much larger fires. Obviously, gaining community awareness in Queensland about bushfire as a risk is difficult. I had a saying as commissioner, unless there was smoke in the air, in the vicinity, Queenslanders weren't interested. Yes, we've had a lot of people migrate here from interstate and are more tuned into bushfire as a problem. But a lot of Queenslanders took a lot of convincing about preparation, preparing their properties, understanding what to do in case of fire. That is changing, and it needs to change, because the threat is building, and the title of this presentation about the intensifying risk for us in Queensland, particularly from Rockhampton south the hinterlands of the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast are very, very high risk potential areas for us, no doubt about it. So there's been a long journey of development and growth, building aerial firefighting capacity, building command and control capacity to deal with these sorts of things. Because with a bushfire, it's not like, for example, a house fire, the red fire truck turns up, puts the fire out, people go back to the station. You've got to be in the field 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So the whole planning and logistics conundrum, anybody who's been in the military would understand that to keep troops in the field, you need the back end, and we didn't have that. We have now, and we've had for a number of years now, and they've got a very large capacity to be able to do that. Our colleagues in the southern states did have that because they were far more used to dealing with bushfire than we were, large scale, very damaging bushfires. Well, what's the future about? You'd look at that slide and think, well, gee, some of that, is that contradictory? Because we're going to get thundering rain, then we're not going to get any, and it's going to be hot, and it's going to be this, it's going to be that. But basically, what climate change and the climate change people are telling us is that our whole weather systems are going to be topsy-turvy. And we certainly need to learn how to adapt and to deal with it and make some real change. So we will get periods of much heavier rainfall, particularly probably in northern Australia, and more cyclones and things like that. Sea level rise, that's going to be an issue. So, and I guess I'll just pause. I'm making an assumption that I'm not here to convert you to climate change. I think most people get it now. And if you want to debate about it later on when we're having a cup of tea, that's fine. But I changed to it because 2006 Cyclone Larry in Innisfail, I started to get the sense from about 2006 onwards, not the sense, the reality, that we were starting to deal with natural disasters virtually every year. Bushfires, not so much, but floods, cyclones. And we had to develop a huge capacity, and that's where the urban search and rescue capacity that Arafni mentioned, that's a capacity to deploy people, to feed people, to keep people living and working in the field, essentially, and it can be adapted to another number of things. So I didn't call it climate change then, but I knew something was actually going on. The frequency of disaster was just ramping up, and it got me greatly concerned, and we needed to develop our capacity to deal with it. Obviously, the impacts here in Queensland, the Great Barrier Reef is a great concern. I'll let you read some of that. Of great concern was fire getting into wet tropics and rainforest. That is a real concern. So things are changing, and we just needed to sort of reset ourselves and understand what this was all meaning. And then later on, we started to think, well, is this related to climate change? What's that actually mean? And where's this all going, and where's it going to end up? In the future, one of the things that we've got to do is, particularly from a bushfire sense, not so much the other natural hazards at the moment. I'm not going to talk about floods and storms and cyclones, but in managing the land is a critical thing for us to do. We've got to get more people working together. And the second dot point there, fire is tenure blind. What I mean by that, it crosses fence lines and boundaries at its own will. It doesn't matter where the boundary of your property is. And you've got to get people at that landscapes go, when I talk about landscape, I mean large hectares of country. It doesn't matter whose property it goes across. And we've got to think about how can we reduce the risk. An important point, we really haven't adapted or utilised Indigenous knowledge anywhere near enough. And one of the things that I was doing a little bit of reading and research, the actual science of hazard reduction, if you like, in biodiversity is only 60 to 70 years old compared to Indigenous knowledge. And that's a bit frightening because we're trying to protect our flora and fauna, obviously, and that's a good thing. But that science really is only about 70 years old. Would have been a different world had we, a couple of hundred years ago, taken more notice of what Indigenous people were doing with their land. There's a lot of work going on now to enable that to happen, and more power to those programs. The saying within the fire service, the person who owns the land owns the fire problem. The fire service doesn't own any land, except a little plot for a fire station here and there. But we've got to get that sorted out. And some people advocate no burning, but that's not feasible in the Australian context. Our bush is designed to burn, it needs to burn, and our problem is our ability to burn strategically and to burn at the right place at the right time. That window, as I said earlier, is very much compressing. So if you look at it this way, Indigenous burning is, Indigenous people burn for cultural reasons, for biodiversity reasons, and to clean up their country. It's a different mindset. Land managers also, to an extent, I mean, parks, forestry, those sort of land managers, burn with biodiversity in mind, but also community and asset protection. QPWS burns and looks after property with those three mantras: life, property, and the environment. We don't actually own any land itself, and like private forestry, they burn to look after their forest assets, primary production. The groups have similar objectives, but they're not all quite the same. And it's about getting people together. And the Queensland Fire and Biodiversity Consortium is a very effective group. Some of you may have heard of it, about getting people together and getting better land management. Because the fundamental issue for me is whether you believe in climate science or climate change or whatever or not. For me, it's as simple as this: we need to pollute less, not to pollute our air, our waterways, and our soil. Because without any of those, we don't grow food, we don't have air to breathe. And that's what's happening in a lot of places. We need, there's a lot of farmers undertaking what's called regenerative farming practices, which I think are quite highly effective. But basically, we have to not, well, the point there, better land management, controlling our pollution is the basic belief that I have, whatever you believe in. Anyway, that's my little rant. But Fire and Rescue Service, or Fire and Emergency Service, and Rural Fire Service, they're very, very keen to work with landholders and to do burning, and it's an educative process for them as well. New recruits get training opportunities. So it's about bringing people together, particularly land management agencies of government, because government owns a huge estate, and they don't necessarily have all the resources they should have to manage that properly. In terms of the science, the past inaction certainly has cost us dearly. and it's definitely going to worsen. There's no doubt about it. We'll continue to experience these multitude of revolving natural hazard disasters that are going to create great pressures. Just let you read that for a moment. So for me, what we saw was in the early 2000s, that change that was happening throughout my world, which was Queensland, and the Fire and Rescue Service, and the impact that was having on us as a service, having to respond to more floods, cyclones, steadily increasing bushfires. Another aside, one of the other capabilities tied up with the USAR is the introduction of swiftwater rescue. Now, we introduced swiftwater rescue into the service, I forget the year now, but mid-2009, maybe a bit earlier. And basically, in the first year we introduced that capability, we had 100 customers. And people said, have you ever seen the movie Field of Dreams? Build it and they shall come. We rescued 100 people from swiftwater events. And we said, well, what happened before we had this capability? And I know what happened as a junior firefighter. You have a round turn and a bowl line tied around your waist and somebody jump into a creek and try and effect a rescue. And aside, swiftwater rescue is one of the most hazardous things that firefighters do. But those sort of changes started to evolve through the organisation. And we had to become much more effective as a broader disaster management, emergency management organisation, not simply a fire service. Tonight, we're talking about bushfires. And I've got a document here you may want to look at a bit later. Can't see it probably in the light, but there's 5 pages of disasters in Queensland from 2006 to April this year. If you go on to the Home Affairs office, Home Affairs Department in Canberra, you can print it out yourself. And you'll see through the years, flood, storm, cyclone, flood, storm, cyclone, bushfire, flood, storm, cyclone, bushfire, flood, storm, bushfire. 18, 19, those 2 years particularly that we've just recently experienced, nothing like it. So whilst those other natural hazards are certainly the main natural hazard that we experience, the threat of bushfire here in Queensland is increasing. Queensland is quite well prepared. I don't think you can ever be too prepared for the fuel, and that's something where that collaborative effort of people working together, land managers, government agencies, fire services, volunteers, all working together. That's just a shot from fires around Yeppoon in 2019. So I want to reassure you that even though this change is real and it's ongoing, Queensland's well placed, Queensland's well experienced, and Queensland has a disaster management system which is very capable of coping with what we've done. The current COVID problem, underlying what the Chief Health Officer and Health are doing, the disaster management system is at work as well. And that's headquartered at Kedron, a major facility there. So we're well equipped, but I know in 1975, there was virtually no rural fire service in Queensland. It was farmer helps farmer. And it wasn't until about 2000 that we started to build a rural fire service that was capable of fighting fires, because most rural firefighters don't want to fight fires. They want to do hazard reduction burns, manage the landscape, and not have to deal with fires. But it got to a point where I basically said, that's the ideal. We don't want to have to be equipped to fight fires. But the reality is we're confronted with fires that we have to do something about. We can't just be land managers and do preventative work. That's what we really want to do. And if that was the circumstance, things would be pretty good. But increasingly so, we're going to be confronted with circumstances where large-scale firefighting efforts, large-scale use of aircraft, machinery at enormous cost is going to be the future. And as I said earlier in the talk, ideally, it's about shifting some of that expenditure to the preventative and preparedness end so that circumstances aren't as bad, if we can do that. That means building, just as we adapted to building homes more suitable for cyclones. I grew up in Townsville. James Cook University did a lot of work in cyclone building. There are what's called the BAL level, the bushfire attack level now standards for building homes. But to build a fireproof home, the cost, and particularly at the moment with tightness of building resources, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars extra to build a home that can withstand some of the bushfires that we've talked about. Anyway, folks, I might leave it there and very happy to answer questions. Thank you.
I'd like some comments on the management of national parks in southeast Queensland. I do a fair bit of bushwalk, and particularly some of the national parks that are old state forests, the old forestry tracks are so overgrown. To me, there's two issues here. One is they should be a barrier for controlled burn. They'll help you with controlled burn. Two, if you try and get in there and fight a fire, there should be a way to get out. And perhaps a way to backburn, a start for backburn. But at the moment, there's so much of southeast Queensland National Park that used to be forestry that is just a big mess. What's your opinion on that one?
Thank you for that question. Well, you could see on my slide, I was talking about the land management agencies don't have the resources. And what's been happening over a period of time is a lot of country, ex-cattle properties, the state government has actually taken over and brought into the fold and basically then said to the land management agencies, there you are, here's a couple of 100,000 extra hectares, and there's no increase. There's no staff, there's no, to my knowledge, increase in resources, and that's a problem. And then that starts a dilemma between primary producers and the parks and forestry people, because you just can't do the work. Plus, the opportunity to get hazard reduction burning is limited. You have to have the right window. And particularly, say on this in the southeast that you're talking about, that urban fringe, citizens don't like burn off smoke. So parks or forestry or somebody will do a burn and the phones run hot and they're told to cool it by their bosses or the politicians. So it's a difficult circumstance, but I think the fact of the matter is they've got way too much land to be able to manage effectively. And I feel sorry, very sorry for them, because it's a difficult circumstance. We do need to introduce fire into our states. There's no doubt about that. You can't not do it. If there was a way that we could avoid putting fire, it'd be great, but I don't think it works in the Australian context, because it needs to burn. But getting the right fire at the right time is the dilemma.
All right, questions from the floor again? Okay, just a minute, I'll give you the microphone.
Thank you for that really interesting talk. I live next to bush, owned by council. Ostensibly, it's a park. I was concerned that the fire break was getting a little too narrow. So I rang the local fire brigade and a couple of chaps came out and they appreciated my call because they actually understood the lay of the land and the access points and gave me a couple of tips about keeping it clean too. So it was a good interchange of concerns. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, all the fire services, rural or urban, very happy to help. The Brisbane City Council's got a pretty good fire management team, but not all local government has the resources around Queensland that obviously Brisbane City Council does.
Okay, while you're still thinking about it, people who are here, we do have some questions from on the chat from those joining us online. So I might read those out, Lee.
Yes, thanks.
So first of all, from John Tasker, who is our current council secretary, member of RGSQ. John says, thank you so much for the presentation, Lee. A very fascinating challenge we now face. Okay, it was a comment. Now from Annie, who is actually our treasurer, really a timely talk as we had the hottest October day since 2004 yesterday. You know, I think everybody is aware it was almost 37 degrees in Brisbane yesterday, and it's just the first week of October. Very informative too. Thank you, Lee. So that was another comment.
I'll just comment there quickly. The other thing is, I come from North Queensland, as I said, but I was in Brisbane from 2001, living here. And Brisbane to me was always a place where there was reliable rainfall. It's not there now. It's definitely changed. You can feel the underlying dryness everywhere you look. And that just exacerbates our whole situation. So the other thing is, yes, we'll get hot days and people said, oh, but during winter we had one of the coldest days, so this climate change stuff's all rubbish. Well, climate and weather are two different things. And what we're sort of prosecuting here is that warming trend that's driving what happens to our climate is real and it's getting worse.
Thank you. So comment here from Ken Granger, whom you may know, I think.
Yeah, I know the name, yes.
Yes.
One of Ralph's colleagues.
Ralph's colleague in the Chem unit many years ago. Okay, so Ken is asking about your comment that there was no rural fire service before 2000. Says check the work of the 1995 audit of rural fires.
Yeah, no, that's picked me up in poor use of language, but basically our rural fire brigades came into the Queensland Fire Service, I think it was called, in 1990 when we reorganised and became part of the state fire services. Prior to that, the point I was making was that the Rural Fires Act was used primarily, we used fire as a primary production tool in Queensland. We still do. And the Rural Fires Act enabled that to happen. And basically, most of our brigades, and there's quite a few of them, were farm-based brigades, primary producer-based brigades, and they assisted and helped each other. But over time, we didn't have a rural fire service like the New South Wales Rural Fire Service or the CFA in Victoria. And that's what we had to build. We had to build trucks and teams and people under a command and control situation. That's what evolved and has evolved over time. It's my comment.
Yes, thanks, Lee, for clarifying that. I think Ken has all sort of followed along those lines and said, yes, there were 30,000 rural fires across the state. Fireys, sorry, fire workers, yes. One of the comments, there was a study by Bob Barchard, then head of rural fires, was that urban fires fight fires, but rural fireys manage fires, which, yeah, again, is your comment. So I hope, Ken, you managed to hear Lee's response and comment to that question.
That was the point I made, that the rural fireys' preference is to be able to manage and control and do the preventative work, which is absolutely perfect world. But we started to get fires that were impinging on what's called the rural-urban interface, or as we called it in Queensland, the I zone, which is the interface of the bush and urbanisation and property assets. And we had to have, I got laughed at when I said it, but rural fire brigades acting like fire brigades. They had to, when the bell rang, attend to a fire to stop property damage. And that's, again, not the ideal that all rural firefighters would like, but that's the circumstance we're now confronted with much more often.
So it's moving in that transition that you mentioned from, you know, what they would like to have ideally, but moving into what's reality.
I don't disagree with that at all.
Yeah,
if we could just do preventative work, it'd be great.
Okay, another question here from John Tasker. You discussed the need for everyone to share in fire management. Are there any strategies in place to support all landholders to manage fire on their property and reduce hazards?
Yes, naturally the Rural Fire Service in Queensland, very, very helpful to property owners, the local brigades themselves, but also the paid staff of Rural Fire Service Queensland, very willing to help people, help them plan, help them understand what to do. The other organisation I mentioned was Queensland Fire and Biodiversity Consortium, a group that helps people actually plan fire strategies for their property, taking into account the biodiversity on their property and the landscape and what have you. So there are a number. Parks and Wildlife have a program, I think it's called like a Good Neighbour program policy, where particularly where they abut primary producers and other housing estates and different things, where they're working hard to improve that as well.
Okay, thank you. So another question from Ken Ranger. Does QPWS employ any scientists these days that can interpret issues such as climate and fuel management? And he comments that the earliest recording mega fire was in Victoria in 1852.
Yeah, that was before it was called a mega fire.
That was before it was called a mega fire.
Yes.
So question though, scientists in QPWS?
Yes, there are a number of scientists in Ralph and Ken's field of work in chemistry and chemical hazards. There's about half a dozen doctors of chemistry, and they do contribute, but there is a new science of fire behaviour analysts, people that you may remember 2018 fires, one of the firefighters standing up with the Premier or whatever about the town of Gracemere. So what they have is interpretive mapping program called Phoenix, which predicts the path of bushfires. And that tool, with all the inputs that the fire behaviour analysts put in, said we need to evacuate Gracemere, which they did. I think most people may remember that circumstance. And out of the University of Melbourne, over quite a number of years, and that was part of the original Bushfire Cooperative Research Centre, some development work about the ability to people to analyse a fire from its starting point and where it's likely to go given temperature, humidity, contours, landscape, all the inputs that go into it. So they can make reasonably accurate predictions about where a fire is likely to end up, which then feeds into the emergency warning environment about letting people know.
Yes, I think fire science has certainly moved on and developed a lot in the last few years, as Lee said. A few more questions here on chat, but we won't. If you've got questions from the in-house audience, please put your hand up. So, oh, okay. Could I just do one more here, and then I'll come to you, Stella? So one from Tony Groom, who many of you may know from Vindevara. Tony's been online with us tonight, and he asks, can you provide a reference for the need to reduce emissions by 75% by 2030? That's a useful figure to quote.
I'll have to go back to the slide. It's probably from the Climate Council. We can dig into that a bit more after, if you like.
Yes, Tony, I hope you heard that response from probably the Climate Council. This one. Now, I'll just move over here to someone in the audience.
Wonderful talk. Thank you, Lee. Very thought-provoking, very challenging. I was just going to ask you, would you have any comments on the recent fires at Vindevara and Fraser Island? Both these places are very close to our hearts, and I just wondered if there were any specific comments you'd make about those fires.
Well, tragedy, really. Bottom line, that was the scary part for us when I mentioned the Youngler fires in 2018 and then Vindevara, to see rainforest suffer like it did, and then the eventual property damage at Vindevara. Very scary stuff. But the underlying, what we always talk about in the fires is about the antecedent conditions. What's the lead up? And it's drought is the #1 factor. So what that proves is any kind of vegetational country will burn under the right circumstances, which for us, with all that natural heritage of rainforest country, we have to be on alert. Fraser Island, I think, I'll go out on a limb here and probably get some feedback, but it was a lost opportunity. My personal view is I believe that the fire may have been able to be controlled a bit earlier than it eventually was. It will revegetate, there's no doubt, and it's doing that now. And I think that I would have liked to have seen some more direct firefighting action. Now, the issue from an ex-fire service person is that the fire service has no jurisdiction in national parks. So the fire was under the control of Parks and Wildlife for a very long time until they asked QPWS to come and take over and then use a whole range of aerial assets and other assets. So I think from the knowledge that I have, and that may be imperfect, there's probably an opportunity where that fire could have been stopped earlier. Fire going through that landscape can be very destructive, there's no doubt about it. Rainforests particularly, because you might have heard me say the next step to continuous fires is desertification or weeds, invasive weeds, and then the whole vegetative structure changes to possibly becoming more fire prone, and the cycle just gets worse. So I'm hoping that Vindevara area and that area the vegetation will come back much to what it was, and certainly for Kungari and Fraser Island that it will also make a good recovery. It's difficult country to fight fire on, there's no doubt about it. But I'll just leave that comment at that.
Okay, time is moving on and we need to give Lee a break, but just a couple more questions here on the chat from Annie. With ageing population in rural areas, what is the future for rural fire brigade units? Are you worried about that? Does volunteer model have to change, or could it change?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. And what's happening in Redlands is a new group of volunteer firefighters has been created to do not so much firefighting, but land management and preventative work. Why is that so? It's because of the premise of that question is that to get resources into regional Queensland, let's talk Queensland, I believe that most of the regional cities need to have some kind of reserve volunteer group to be able to go out and help, because the workforce and the labour force is not there in a lot of our regional areas. The rules surrounding what is an urban fire district and a rural fire district sort of prohibit that. For example, there cannot be a rural fire brigade inside Brisbane City because it's part of the urban fire levy and the district. But I think some work needs to be done on maybe creating reserve forces of some kind of citizens and younger people in the cities who would be prepared to be trained and be able to be deployed to provide relief crews and to assist on that broader scale. I think it's a real issue and it's a real problem right across Australia. So I think an answer for Queensland could be Cairns, Townsville, Rocky, those sort of places could provide bases for some sort of reserve volunteer force, if you like.
Okay, thanks. And Annie did provide a reference for Tony, and he has seen that. That's the Climate Council actions petition cut emissions by 75%. So will they see that on you will, if you look at the YouTube recording, you'll see that also. So I think last question here for this evening from chat, from Chris and Robin. Do you have any breakdown of fires deliberately lit, unintentionally lit, or by lightning and natural causes? I guess Chris is asking, do you have a feeling for breakdown of those that might be deliberately lit versus others?
Look, there probably was a time I'd have those statistics rattled off as I'd be briefed by the media people in the team. But I think what I would refer to is a lot of media excitement during the 2019-20 fires was about this notion that every fire that started was an arsonist, and it just wasn't true, and it isn't true. Certainly, there is a range of fires caused by arsonists, and in some cases, even firefighters, volunteer firefighters, deliberately set fires. But when you have a bush that's under such extreme pressure and stress from drought, it doesn't take much at all. Lightning, there'll be more lightning, particularly in more isolated areas of the bush. The notion that it's all arsonists' fault just doesn't cut it. The statistics do not match that. And accidental fires, farmers using machinery, people welding, cutting, grinding, even harvesting times can create issues with fire. But I don't have the full breakdown in my mind at the moment. I've purged myself of some of that over 6 years in retirement, but I would suspect some of the basis of that question was about there was a real big push there in the media at one stage about arsonists running all over the place and lighting fires. Certainly happens, but not to the extent it was being portrayed as.
Okay, thank you. Are there any last questions from the floor here, from the audience here? Okay, if not, I'll conclude the formal part of the evening. And certainly both those joining us from online and members present here, I'm sure want to give a big thank you to Lee for an excellent talk, challenging, of course, this whole topic, that we need to be aware of that. Not only was yesterday the hottest October day for quite a long time, but just on this morning's news, you may have caught the news report that our fire risk this week is very high in southeast Queensland, was reported. So certainly a very timely topic. Now, so will you please join me in thanking Lee for this evening's talk? Lee, just a small token of our appreciation. Thank you very much.
Gratefully received. Thank you.
Yes,
Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Now, well, as Lee mentioned, you know, we did try to, you may recall, last year, the Society did try to get up a climate forum, and we had to cancel it because of the lockdown last year. Lee was very kindly agreed to come here. I think it was the July lecture, and that was just the lockdown as well. So we're very pleased that we could actually manage to get Lee here with us this evening. So thank you again, Lee, and I hope you'll join us for a bit of supper now.
Thank you.
Okay.